Margaret tried everything by the book. First came the polite neighbor-to-neighbor conversation, complete with a welcome basket containing her award-winning blackberry preserves. Karen accepted the gift with a tight smile, but dismissed Margaret's concerns about Bruno. Perhaps her little hobby farm isn't suited for this neighborhood, Karen suggested, gesturing to her own meticulously landscaped yard that looked transported straight from a suburban magazine. I paid good money to escape the city, not to live next to Old MacDonald. Next came the documentation phase, after Bruno's third incursion, which left one duckling with a limp that the local vet said might be permanent. Margaret installed motion-triggered cameras. She captured Bruno digging under the reinforced fence she'd installed at considerable expense. The evidence went to animal control, where Officer Jenkins, no relation, sighed as he reviewed the footage. "Look, Ms. Jenkins, I sympathize, but we're understaffed. Best I can do is issue a warning." "A warning? Her dog injured my duckling. Unless there's a human injury or livestock killed, and the county doesn't classify your ducks as livestock, my hands are tied." The breaking point came during an unseasonably warm spring afternoon. Margaret was hosting her granddaughter's 6th birthday party. Emma had specifically requested to celebrate with the ducks she adored. 12 kindergartners were decorating duck-shaped cookies when Bruno burst through the garden, followed by Karen power walking with weights strapped to her wrists. The children screamed, cookies flew, and little Emma watched in horror as Bruno cornered 2 ducks against the shed. Margaret saw her granddaughter's tears and something inside her snapped. That evening, after the traumatized children had been picked up and Emma had cried herself to sleep, Margaret sat on her porch with a glass of whiskey and her laptop, searching for solutions more effective than fences or official complaints. The annual Willowbrook Garden Club Tour was the social event of the spring, and Karen had been selected to showcase her property, a fact she'd mentioned loudly and repeatedly at the last 3 community meetings. The day arrived with perfect weather, and from her kitchen window, Margaret watched a procession of luxury SUVs park along their shared road. Karen had transformed her backyard into something from a lifestyle magazine spread. White linen-covered tables dotted the lawn, a string quartet played near a rose arbor, and caterers in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne flutes. Karen herself wore a cream-colored designer dress and wide-brimmed hat as she led the first group of visitors, gesturing grandly toward her imported Japanese maples. Margaret had planned to keep a low profile that day, but fate, or rather Bruno, had other ideas. Whether attracted by the catering smells or simply bored, the chocolate lab slipped away from the festivities and made a beeline for Margaret's duck pond. The security cameras caught his determined digging at the spot where he'd breached before. This time, however, the ducks didn't panic and scatter. They simply waddled toward the pond house, almost smugly, Margaret would later think, as if they knew what was coming. The cameras captured the moment perfectly. Bruno froze mid-stride as 2 white shapes emerged from behind the duck house. Thor and Valkyrie stood side by side, necks extended to their full impressive height, wings slightly spread in the classic threat display. The dog tilted his head in confusion, having never encountered waterfowl that didn't flee. When Bruno took another hesitant step forward, the geese attacked with military precision. Thor went left, Valkyrie right, wings now fully extended, making them appear twice their actual size. Their honking, a sound that could only be described as a trumpet being played through a bullhorn, echoed across both properties. Bruno retreated, but the geese pursued, herding him back toward the party. Margaret rushed outside just in time to see the dog bowl through the garden tour, the geese in close formation behind him. Champagne glasses shattered. A violinist stumbled into the koi pond, instrument held high. The garden club president found herself sprawled across a table of petite fours, and Karen, perfect, pristine Karen, backed away from the advancing geese until she tripped over her imported stone landscaping and landed directly in a freshly fertilized rose bed. Thor and Valkyrie, mission accomplished, strutted back to Margaret's property, occasionally looking back as if daring anyone to follow. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of a garden hat floating gently across the koi pond. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived from Karen's lawyer, demanding compensation for the vicious foul attack. Margaret responded with her own letter, attaching all the documented incidents, vet bills, and video evidence of Bruno's repeated trespassing. No further legal action materialized. Instead, a professional fence company arrived the following week to install a state-of-the-art boundary between the properties, paid for by Karen. Bruno began attending a rigorous training program, visible through the fence wearing a bright orange Terrain-E vest. The most surprising development came a month later when Karen approached the property line when Margaret was gardening. For the first time, she didn't look angry or superior. She looked thoughtful. "Your birds," she said carefully. "The big white ones. Would they work for other deterrents? The deer are destroying my Japanese maples." Margaret hid her smile as she straightened up, brushing soil from her hands. "They might. They're not pets, though. They're working animals with their own ideas about things. I could pay you," Karen offered, "for consultation." Margaret considered the woman who had made her life miserable for months. "Consultation starts with respect," she said finally, "for all living things on both sides of the fence." As if on cue, Thor and Valkyrie appeared at Margaret's side, regarding Karen with their intense orange gaze. Karen swallowed visibly, but held her ground. Perhaps, Margaret thought as she invited her neighbor in for lemonade and goose management strategies, karma worked in more mysterious ways than she'd imagined. Sometimes it took the form of righteous chaos at a garden party, but sometimes, just sometimes, it created unlikely bridges between worlds that needed to understand each other a little better. Later that afternoon, Margaret spotted Karen in her backyard, directing a landscaping crew as they installed what appeared to be a water feature, an artificial pond with a tiered fountain that seemed oddly out of place against the natural backdrop of the woods beyond. Bruno bounded around the workers, still unleashed, occasionally darting toward the property line before Karen casually called him back. "This isn't over," Margaret murmured, reaching for her phone to document the dog's behavior. If Karen thought she was dealing with a pushover, some quaint country bumpkin she could dismiss, she was sorely mistaken. Margaret Jenkins had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts with sharks in business suits. She wasn't about to be intimidated by a woman in Lululemon with an untrained dog. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across her land, Margaret walked the property line with a tape measure and notebook, methodically documenting every inch of the boundary. Her ducks watched cautiously from their shelter, still shaken from the morning's events. She looked at their nervous movements and felt a fierce protectiveness rise within her. "Don't worry," she told them as she made her final notes. "We're not letting this stand." She'd always been a reasonable person, open to compromise and negotiation. But as she looked toward Karen's brightly lit house, all plate glass and angular architecture, Margaret felt something unfamiliar harden in her chest, the absolute certainty that she was in the right and that this woman needed to learn about country living the hard way. Old Farmer Wilson eyed Margaret skeptically at the Saturday farmers market as she described her ongoing neighbor troubles. He paused while weighing her usual order of feed, a gleam appearing in his rheumy eyes. "What you're describing isn't a dog problem. It's a karma deficit," he said, lowering his voice. "Karma doesn't always work on its own schedule. Sometimes it needs enforcers." 3 days later, Margaret's truck bounced down the rutted path to Wilson's remote farm. In the back, secured in large animal carriers, were Thor and Valkyrie, 2 massive Emden geese with wingspans that could stretch over 6 feet and piercing orange eyes that seemed to assess Margaret's worthiness. "These ain't your average lawn ornaments," Wilson warned as he demonstrated how to handle the birds. "Emdens were used as guard animals in Europe for centuries. They've got excellent memories, territorial instincts that would put a Rottweiler to shame, and they can deliver a bite with 300 pounds of pressure." Margaret listened, fascinated, as Wilson detailed their training regimen. Unlike her nervous ducks, these geese feared nothing. They'd been raised with dogs present and had learned not to flee but to confront. "But remember," Wilson cautioned as Margaret prepared to leave, "once you deploy the nuclear option, there's no going back. These birds will protect what's theirs, but they don't understand property lines drawn by humans. The integration took 2 weeks. Margaret kept the geese in a separate enclosure, allowing them to observe the ducks from a distance. She walked them on leads around the property boundaries, teaching them the territory they were to defend. The ducks initially kept their distance, but gradually accepted their larger cousins, especially after Valkyrie chased away a hawk that had been circling the pond. Karen, meanwhile, had escalated her campaign. After Margaret's formal complaint, she retaliated by reporting Margaret's coop to the county for unsightly structures and organizing a petition among other neighbors about the disruptive farm smells. She made a point of walking Bruno off-leash along the property line daily, watching with satisfaction as the ducks retreated in fear. She hadn't noticed the newcomers yet. Margaret made sure of that by keeping the geese on the far side of her property. But the day of reckoning was inevitable, and it came sooner than expected. Margaret Jenkins jolted awake to the sound of frantic quacking and a dog's excited barking. Still in her flannel pajamas, she grabbed the baseball bat she kept beside her bed, not for intruders, but for the occasional raccoon, and sprinted barefoot across the dewy morning grass. The scene at her duck pond made her blood boil. A chocolate Labrador was splashing through the water, sending her prize Pekin ducks flying in panic, while a few yards away, a woman in designer yoga wear stood scrolling through her phone, completely unconcerned. "Call your dog off right now," Margaret shouted, the bat gripped tightly in her weathered hands. 5 years of peaceful retirement on her dream homestead, building everything from scratch after 30 years of corporate spreadsheets, and now this. The woman, later identified as Karen Wilcox, looked up with an expression of mild annoyance. "Bruno's just playing. Don't be so dramatic." Bruno had managed to corner one of the ducks, Daisy, Margaret's favorite. The little duck was trembling so violently that Margaret feared she might die from shock, something city folks never seemed to understand about waterfowl. "Playing?" Margaret's voice rose as she waded into the pond, her pajama bottoms soaking instantly. "My duck could literally die from fear. Get your dog." Only when Margaret raised the bat did Karen finally whistle for Bruno, who reluctantly abandoned his pursuit. As they retreated across the property line, which the dog had clearly breached, Karen called over her shoulder, "You might want to consider a real fence instead of that pathetic chicken wire. This is the country after all." Margaret stood dripping in her pond, cradling the trembling Daisy, and knew the battle lines had been drawn. Back in her kitchen, Margaret wrapped Daisy in a soft towel and examined her for injuries. The duck's rapid heartbeat pulsed against her palm, but thankfully she found no wounds, just terror. The other 5 ducks huddled in their shelter, still too frightened to venture out. This wasn't just an inconvenience. These birds were her companions, each with distinct personalities that had become as familiar to her as old friends. "It's okay, sweet girl," she murmured, stroking Daisy's feathers. "That rude woman won't let it happen again." But even as she said it, Margaret knew better. Through her kitchen window, she could see the back of Karen's property, a recent construction that had replaced the old Henderson's modest farmhouse with what locals called ink mansions. The property had been subdivided and sold off last fall, and Karen was the first arrival in what the realtor had enthusiastically marketed as Willowbrook Estates, luxury country living. Margaret had watched with growing dismay as bulldozers cleared century-old oak trees to make way for the sprawling houses. She had signed petitions and attended township meetings to protest the development, but money talked louder than local concerns. Now, instead of the Hendersons' friendly waves and shared vegetable harvests, she had Karen. After settling Daisy with the others, Margaret changed out of her soaked pajamas and made herself a strong cup of coffee. She'd left corporate America precisely to avoid people like Karen Wilcox, entitled, inconsiderate, and completely divorced from the realities of rural life. Her homestead was her sanctuary, meticulously planned and lovingly cultivated. The duck pond, shielded by willows and bordered with native plants, was the crown jewel, a perfect ecosystem that attracted frogs, dragonflies, and the occasional visiting heron. The property line between them was marked by a meandering creek and the simple chicken wire fence Margaret had installed to keep predators out, not to keep her ducks in. They rarely wandered, preferring the safety of their familiar territory. Until today, it had been sufficient. Margaret sipped her coffee and pulled out her township's ordinance book. Another relic from her corporate days was her thoroughness in understanding the rules. According to Section 7.3, all dogs in the rural district had to be under control of their owners at all times, either by leash, fencing, or demonstrable voice command. Bruno had clearly failed that test, and Karen had made no real attempt to control him until threatened.